Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Women's History Month and Atlanta Commemoration event, co-hosted by the White House Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Senior Liaisons Team, the White House Office of Public Engagement, and the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. My name is Morgan Mills, and I am a policy assistant working on the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders Senior Liaisons Team in the Chief of Staff's office. I will be co-hosting this event today alongside Rebecca Lee, Deputy Director of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And I would also quickly like to take this opportunity to acknowledge Howard O, who is an Associate Director for the White House Office of Public Engagement and has been instrumental in organizing today's event.
Thank you, Morgan. The purpose of today's event is to not only celebrate Women's History Month, but to also commemorate the anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings and provide a healing space as we grapple with the gender-based anti-Asian violence pervading the nation. We are honored that you have chosen to be here with us today. We have an incredible lineup of extraordinary AA and NHPI women leaders from across the administration and the nonprofit world.
So with that, I will kick off the program by introducing Erica Moritsugu, our first speaker. Erica Moritsugu is a Deputy Assistant to the President and the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander liaison here at the White House. The floor is yours, Erica.
Thank you, Morgan. Aloha, y'all. We're honored that you're joining us today to celebrate Women's History Month. But as you're all aware, we're also here to commemorate the Atlanta spa murders, which we marked the anniversary of last week, where 6 women of Asian descent and 2 others were murdered. This sad anniversary comes in the wake of the tragic murders of Michelle Go, Christina Yuna, Lee Guiyang Ma in New York City that we've heard a bit about in the news, and also the 2 recent murders of 2 Asian women murdered in Albuquerque, New Mexico, of all places earlier this month that we've hardly heard anything about in the news. These are, of course, just a few examples of the violence AA and NHPI women have been facing. And as we've seen, even more attacks in just the last week. While there is still undoubtedly a lot of work to be done in responding to this spike in violence and supporting AA and NHPI and other women of color, I'd like to take a few moments to reflect on the important historical gender equity work of the Biden-Harris administration this past year. 1 year ago, President Biden established the White House Gender Policy Council, charged with leading a government-wide effort to advance gender equity and equality domestically and abroad. Last Wednesday, the White House released a fact sheet detailing the specific steps that the President and the Gender Policy Council have taken to advance equal rights and opportunities. Over the past year, the President and the Gender Policy Council have expanded economic opportunity and supported women in the workforce, including by providing immediate relief to millions of women through the American Rescue Plan, and issuing an executive order increasing the minimum wage that benefits women who are disproportionately minimum wage workers. Together, GPC and the President have worked to present and respond to gender-based violence by directing $1 billion in supplemental funding for domestic violence and sexual assault services through the American Rescue Plan, including $49.5 million for culturally specific community-based organizations. We've worked with Congress to reauthorize and strengthen the Bipartisan Violence Against Women Act, signed into law the National Events Authorization Act, the amendments to the Victims of Crime Act, and the Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment. And we're reviewing the Title IX regulations, developing a national action plan to end gender-based violence and addressing the crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls. The President and the Gender Policy Council have expanded access to healthcare and reproductive healthcare, including by providing women access to quality, affordable healthcare coverage through the American Rescue Plan, issuing a presidential memorandum expanding access to reproductive healthcare and revoking the Mexico City policy. And we're working to improve maternal health and eliminate racial disparities by extending coverage for pregnant women postpartum. These are just a few of the steps the Biden-Harris administration has taken to advance gender equity and opportunity. I'd encourage you to check out the full fact sheet to learn more about the GPC's historic work thus far and also the vision of what we intend to strive towards moving forward. I just want to close by quoting the Vice President and the message that she sent to the local community in Atlanta last week. She said, quote, "1 year ago, our nation endured a heinous act of violence. This is an act born of racism, sexism, and hate. Today, as a nation, we bear witness to the intolerance that still exists and has sadly long existed in our society. In particular, we bear witness to the increase in violence and discrimination in the past few years against Asian American women. And we recommit to doing all we can to ensure all Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander individuals and communities are safe from violence, discrimination, and fear. And that's our commitment to you here today. So with that, mahalo for the opportunity to share this space with you. Morgan, with thanks, I'm going to turn the Zoom floor back to you.
Thank you, Erica. Next, we'd like to introduce Crystal Kai, Executive Director of the White House Initiative and President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Crystal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rebecca, and aloha everyone, and happy Women's History Month. On behalf of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, or what we call WHIAANHPI, we are honored to co-host today's National Stakeholder Briefing for Women's History Month and to mark the one-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa murders. The theme of this year's Women's History Month is women providing healing, promoting hope. It is so fitting for today's event. These past 2 years have truly been unlike any other, as our communities have faced multiple crises due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to the disproportionate health and economic impacts of the pandemic, there has also been a pandemic of hate targeting many in the Asian American community. In fact, according to a recent study by the Center for Study of Hate and Extremism, the number of reported anti-Asian hate crimes across a dozen of America's largest cities increased by 339% over the past year. In particular, we've also seen AA and NHPI women who have been disproportionately targeted with nearly 3 in 4 AA and NHPI women reporting that they have experienced racism or discrimination over the past year, according to a new survey by the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. Because those statistics are based upon reported incidents and not all victims report their incidents of hate, we know that these statistics are likely do not represent the full scale of the problem. And so as you know, we just mentioned, as Erica mentioned, just last week, we marked the tragic one-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings, in which a gunman targeted 3 separate Asian-run businesses and killed 8 people, including 6 women of Asian descent. And I will just say that amid the alarming surge in anti-Asian hate and violence targeting Asian Americans throughout the pandemic, these horrific murders last year shook our community to its very core. And overnight, we saw how Atlanta's tragedy became a nation's tragedy. It propelled the Asian American community into the spotlight and brought visibility to the pain and fear that so many Asian American, and in particular Asian American women, were facing. Feelings that were heightened throughout the pandemic due to misinformation, stigma, and racist rhetoric that equated our communities with the virus. As Erica mentioned, President Biden and Vice President Harris know that any federal response to address the multitude of challenges impacting our nation must include the diverse voices of women, as well as our diverse AA and NHPI communities. And that is why, in addition to the actions that Erica highlighted regarding the administration's efforts to advance gender equity and opportunity, in May of last year, the president also signed Executive Order 14031 to reestablish the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, and to authorize the creation of the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Both of these entities are charged with coordinating a whole of government response to advance equity, justice, and opportunity for our communities, including efforts to combat incidents of anti-Asian hate and to promote the safety and well-being of our communities. So in closing, we are just so grateful to all of you for joining us today as we mark both Women's History Month and commemorate the one-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa murders. With that, I will turn it back over to Morgan.
Thank you, Crystal. Next, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Ambassador Catherine Tai. Ambassador Tai was sworn in as the 19th United States Trade Representative on March 18, 2021. As a member of the President's Cabinet, Ambassador Tai is a principal trade advisor, negotiator, and spokesperson on U.S. trade policy. We are also so honored to have Ambassador Tai serve as the co-chair of both the White House Initiative and the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Ambassador Tai, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for that thoughtful introduction. I'm joining you today from Baltimore, where I'm hosting a dialogue on the future of Atlantic trade with the United Kingdom's Secretary of State for Trade, Anne-Marie Trevelyan. Let me begin by sharing a few reflections about my role in the Biden-Harris administration. As the United States Trade Representative, my job is to execute the President's vision for a trade policy that honors the dignity of all workers and creates inclusive prosperity. As co-chair of the White House Initiative and President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, I have the responsibility, along with HHS Secretary Javier Becerra, to drive an ambitious whole-of-government agenda to advance equity, justice, and opportunity for Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. In both of these capacities, it is my honor and duty to work toward a better world and to build a more fair, resilient, and connected country that lives up to the principles and ideals on which we founded it. Whether they are entire countries and economies or individual leaders and communities, engaging allies and partners is critical to success in these efforts. Last week, I traveled to Michigan with South Korean Trade Minister Han Koo-yo to mark the 10th anniversary of the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement and to share how the Biden administration's agenda is committed to promoting competitiveness and innovation. While there, I also joined a vigil in Detroit with members of the AA and NHPI community. Together, we paid tribute to the upcoming 40-year anniversary of Vincent Chin's murder and remembered the 8 lives lost in Atlanta last year: Delana Yan, Paul Michaels, Xiaojie Tan, Dao Yo Feng, Sun Cha Kim, Hyung Jung Grant, Sun Chung Park, and Yong A Yue. This month, we have the obligation to recognize that hate and violence directed at the AA and NHPI communities is not new in America, and that it has increased in alarming frequency and degree in the last few years, and that it has particularly targeted the women in our communities. At the same time, we seize the opportunity to remind ourselves that from these dynamic and fast-growing communities, women emerge as great American leaders, trailblazers, champions, defenders, and supporters, whether as our vice president, gold medal Olympians, journalists, scientists, CEOs, movie stars, movie directors, judges, advocates, organizers, teachers, doctors, nurses, caretakers, big sisters who will stand up to bullies. Our communities are blessed with the strength of fighters and builders. I am especially proud to represent an administration that recognizes this and has, for the first time in history, put racial and gender equity at the center of its agenda. I am proud that the president signed the executive order that established the initiative and commission that I co-chair and appointed brilliant commissioners and dedicated staff to ensure its success. I am proud that our president signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, and I am proud to serve in the president's cabinet. As we all work to perfect our union to make it more tolerant, just, and equal, we must maintain our collective strength, empathy, support, and push back on the forces that try to divide us. We have a collective duty and responsibility to realize the hopes and dreams of the generations of trailblazing women who paved the way, opened doors, and shattered glass ceilings. I am inspired by the committed, determined, resilient women that I have met in my travels across this country and around the world. It has been an important first year filled with many firsts. And as I hear my own mother's voice in my head, we have so much more work to do. I'm looking forward to doing this work with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai, so much for those wonderful remarks. Next, we have Vanessa Chen. Vanessa is a special assistant to the president for criminal justice and guns policy here, and she worked at the White House and she works in the Domestic Policy Council. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for having me here. I first of all want to thank Ambassador Tai, Erica, and Crystal for your leadership. I want to thank all of the commissioners for your service, and I want to thank every single one of you for speaking up and speaking out, building solidarity and protecting our communities, and in doing so, honoring the lives that have been lost to anti-Asian violence and being forces of strength and healing. Last week, we marked the somber anniversary of the 1 year of the murders of 8 people, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent. The horrors and tragedy of that day for the victims, their families, and our Asian American community are stark reminders of the human toll anti-AAPI sentiment has taken throughout this pandemic and it is a horrific reminder of the racism, misogyny, hatred, discrimination, and harassment that our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities have experienced throughout our nation's history. While hate crimes in general rose 11% across a dozen of America's largest cities, anti-Asian hate crimes surged 339% in 2021. But statistics alone, even ones as stark as those, do not capture the devastating impact this has had on our communities. We have lost grandmothers, mothers, and sisters to violence. Our children and elders have been afraid to go to school, take public transit, or even leave the house. Asian American businesses have been vandalized, boycotted, and forced to close. For far too long in our nation's history, our pleas for help, our calls for support, and demands for justice went unanswered. No longer. Last week, advocates protesting anti-Asian violence were held in a dozen cities nationwide, including Atlanta, Houston, Detroit, San Francisco, and New York City. We emphasize that we will not be silent, we need support, and we deserve justice. Empowering communities starts at the very top. President Biden has built an administration that represents America. AA and NHPIs are represented at the top levels of the administration in the cabinet, such as Ambassador Tai, heads of agencies, and among White House staff itself, like me. The significance of lived experience and representation is reflected in President Biden's whole of government approach to prevent, intervene, respond, and assist victims and communities in healing from xenophobia, racism, and hate. As the Special Assistant to the President for Criminal Justice and Guns Policy in the Domestic Policy Council, I have the privilege of driving the development and implementation of the President's domestic policy agenda in the White House and across the federal government, especially with the focus on racial and gender equity. In May, President Biden signed into law the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, bipartisan legislation that made significant improvements to our nation's response to hate crime. It addressed the lack of resources and training for state and local law enforcement to accurately identify and report hate crimes to the FBI. It also addressed language and cultural barriers that many communities and communities of color face in reporting hate crimes to law enforcement. In May, during AA and NHPI Heritage Month, President Biden signed Executive Order 14031, which reestablished and expanded WHIAANHPI, and it also established the Presidential Commission to advise President Biden on many topics, including how to address anti-Asian xenophobia and violence. Through WHIAANHPI and his commission, this will allow President Biden to deliver his ambitious whole of government agenda, including by coordinating a comprehensive federal response to the rising acts of anti-Asian bias and violence. In addition to those responses that the president will drive forward in the coming months with the leadership of WHIAANHPI and the Presidential Commission, one of the president's pillars of his unity agenda is addressing our nation's unprecedented mental health crisis, including the grief, trauma, and isolation experienced by our communities in the wake of these incidents. While we are heartbroken, horrified, and exhausted as a community, we are also united, supported, and more determined than ever in our demands for justice. While these are important achievements that the administration has made, with anti-Asian hate crimes continuing, it is clear that we must do more to honor the memory of all victims by coming together to ensure the support for and safety of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Next, we have Carrie Pugh, Director of External Affairs in the Office of Intergovernmental and External Affairs in the Department of Health and Human Services. Carrie, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thanks, Rebecca. And thank you so much for convening us for this important conversation. I'm honored to represent HHS today, and we at HHS are proud to be the home of WHIAANHPI. For too long, systemic barriers have put the American dream out of reach for many in our communities. As many speakers have already indicated, racism and xenophobia continue to threaten the safety and dignity of countless families. And unfortunately, AA and NHPI women have been disproportionately impacted with targeted anti-Asian violence. I'm proud to be part of an administration that has chosen to build back a better country, an administration that has identified the unique ways the issues that we face as a nation impact the AA and NHPI communities and have chosen to respond directly. Over the past year, we have worked to expand health equity by ensuring that people have access to the COVID vaccine and therapeutics, to testing and masking, and to quality healthcare. Today, through a variety of efforts, including culturally competent messaging and in partnership with so many of you, more than 216 million Americans, millions of whom belong to AA and NHPI families, have been vaccinated. This has not happened by chance. We've routinely engaged AA and NHPI communities on our vaccine competence work. For example, the Slow the Spread campaign and the Building Vaccine Confidence campaigns was launched in 14 AA and NHPI different languages. Through the American Rescue Plan, we have lowered or eliminated health insurance premiums for millions, including nearly 200,000 uninsured AA and NHPI individuals. Now a record number of 14.5 million Americans have quality, affordable coverage. But that's not all. Hundreds of billions of dollars in American Rescue Plan funds have been allocated to community-based violence prevention and family violence prevention programs, mental health support resources, expansions of certified community behavioral health clinics, and the easy to remember 988 suicide and crisis line to be launched this July. And finally, we have invested billions of dollars to expand the healthcare workforce, and we have prioritized the behavioral health of children, youth, and their families with an emphasis on improving access to care, promoting equity, and fostering innovation. I close with an ask of all of you. Be our partners, continue to help us turn the dials of progress, and help us get it right. Together, let's fight anti-Asian bias, promote health equity, and ensure Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander families not only recover from the crises confronting us, but that we truly build a better America in the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Next, we have Rohini Kusupu. Rohini is a Deputy Assistant to the President and the Domestic Policy Advisor to the Vice President. The floor is yours, Rohini.
Hi, everyone. In the words of the commemoration of the 1 year mark of the shooting, I turn back to the words of the Vice President who said last year in Atlanta, everyone has, quote, the right to be recognized as American, not as the other, not as them, but as us. So I remind us of that line because for those of us who work for the Vice President, it impacts the work we do, the people we serve, and what our values we share. As Domestic Policy Advisor to the Vice President, when we put ideas or policies in front of her, she will often question us. Who are we leaving out? Who are we not thinking about? And how will this policy affect the person and how will they experience it? All questions that we need to ask for people that have not traditionally been seen as American and traditionally have been seen as the other and not at times us. So the work we do, as much as our team works with the White House on policy every day, we can't forget what it means to have a president and a vice president who speak out against violence and hate and discrimination. The words they speak to highlight our ideals, our higher ideals around racial equity and gender equity speak volumes for this administration and also how we want our country to be. So in closing, I want all of you to know on behalf of the Vice President, our office is an open door for the community and for all the work so many of you are doing on the ground to build coalitions, to increase access to the ballot, and to just make the world a more just and fair one for our children. We stand with you and thank you.
Thank you so much, Rohini. Thank you for delivering that message from the Vice President. Next up, in the spirit of healing, we have a special musical performance. Hollis Wong-Ware is a Grammy-nominated singer and songwriter and will be performing Subliminal. Hollis?
Thank you, Rebecca. My name is Hollis Wong-Ware. I'm an artist based in Los Angeles, and thank you so much for having me. Through the pandemic and the rise of violence in our community, I've learned that arts and creativity have become more essential than ever to grieve, heal, and imagine a future beyond violence. Over the last year, I've had the honor to co-curate a collection of Asian American women and non-binary music artists by the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center called Brave Space, along with our closing performer, Erica Shimizu Banks. Brave Space is an audio project to create songs of reflection, meditation, and healing for us, by us, for our community. I wrote this song Subliminal in response to this deep need and will also be the title track for my debut full-length album coming out this May. This song is meant for healing, touching base with ourselves in real time and analog time, and peeling yourself away from your screen. So I invite you to close your eyes, take a breath, and tap into your inner voice for this performance. This is Subliminal.
You've been straining to prove who you are, but you're already here, just dissolve in the calm, you'll revolve and the net will appear, the future is near. Sacred attention is all we can pay. Hold it like a secret and cradle it safe. Settle down, sleep into the
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hollis, for that incredible performance. We're so lucky to have you. So next, we'll turn over for a fireside chat with Erica Mitsugu, who will be in conversation with Amanda Nguyen, the founder and CEO of RISE, and Sunyoung Choi Morrow, the executive director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and Phi Nguyen, the executive director for Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta.
Morgan, thank you. There's only one thing that could possibly follow such a heartfelt performance by Hollis, and that is to be in dialogue with these fierce sisters. I am humbled to be amongst them on this Zoom screen. I have so much admiration for them, their strength and their commitment and their leadership. And just thank you for sharing this space with us today, Fee and Amanda and Sungyeon. I'd like to open up this discussion with maybe a little bit of a non-traditional question for such a professional engagement, but I'm wondering if you could share with us how you're doing. I mean, again, the fierceness and the grit and the courage that you show up with, everything that you have to carry because you've been such strong leaders. I'm wondering if you would be able to share with us how you're dealing with these tragic and senseless attacks that we've seen and the rise of violence against Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, not just as prominent leaders in the women's community, the AA and NHPI community, but also as community members and as women. So, Fee, do you mind if I start with you with that question? How are you coping and doing and leading and still self-caring, if that's possible?
Thanks for the question, Erica. Well, I'm hanging in there, and I will say in the aftermath of the spa shootings last March, as a leader in the Asian American community here in Georgia, I and my colleagues and other community members sprang into rapid response to wrap community care and resources around the survivors and the victims' families. And so that didn't really leave very much space for me or for other community leaders to process or grieve. And so in marking the 1-year anniversary of the shootings this year, it was really important to me to help bring our community together to collectively grieve and reflect and center our healing. And I think we were able to do that at the community remembrance that we held the Saturday before March 16th. And that was something that we wanted to offer to the community. But I think that in holding that, it also created a healing space for me as a leader as well. So I think I'm doing a little bit better right now.
Thank you for being so strong for the community, but also, centering yourself in that as well. It's something that's maybe overlooked or unseen. Amanda, do you have any reflections here? How are you doing?
Well, I love that you opened with this question. It speaks to your leadership and to the community. It honestly feels like my soul is being torn in half. We're at a moment of reckoning right now. The world is with our community. But in this darkness, I feel solidarity like these events. So thank you so much for having me here today and for gathering us.
Thank you, Amanda. Sungyeon, you and I, for the past year and before that, have laughed wryly, and it's not been funny laugh, but we've also cried together, right? Because you carry so much. And I know that you care about not just the community that you have to lead, but your team and your family. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's not every day I get asked that question, believe it or not, where other than formality. And so, I'm with Amanda. I appreciate you opening with this question. I have a mix of emotions and feelings. I think a lot of last week, people have been asking about, well, it's been a year since the Atlanta spa shooting. How are you feeling? And it's been a year and it's been a week since, a woman got beat up 125 times in New York City. And it's only been a month since Christina Yunali was murdered. And it's only less than 2 months since Michelle Go was murdered. And so I often reflect on the fact that we haven't really had much of space, and the grieving and the sort of, it's both grieving as a broader community, but also the anxiety around what it feels like to be living as an Asian American woman these days. And from our research, we also know that it's not just East Asian women, it is Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander women across the board are feeling anxious about safety. And so that is hard. And yet we're talking about it. People want to hear from us. They want to know how we're feeling, what's happening, learn more. In fact, Amanda and I met for the first time in person last week because we had an opportunity to talk to a broader audience at CNN about what it's like living, in our community right now with the rising violence. And so I feel both really exhausted and sad and scared, and also hopeful that we are having conversations, and that, hopefully we're moving towards some sort of long-term solution.
Yeah, I think that's important to hold how somber and important and weighty this feels, but also to lift our eyes up about what the hope looks like in terms of the push forward, which we only get through and only get to talk about because of leaders like you, all of you. Fee, I'm wondering, from your perspective, what do you think it's important for people to understand about when we talk about anti-Asian violence?
I think when we talk about anti-Asian violence, I think it's important for us to understand that it's not just about interpersonal violence. It's not just about the deaths and the physical attacks that we've seen on the news. And it's not necessarily always rooted in hate. I think anti-Asian violence also includes the forms of violence that may not be highly visible to us. It includes systemic and structural violence, including state violence like incarceration and deportation. I will never forget that the day before the spa shootings last year, our communities were grieving the deportation of 33 Vietnamese refugees back to Vietnam. And so I think when we talk about anti-Asian violence and how to address it, we have a responsibility and an obligation to be expansive in our framework and to acknowledge the ways that our own government inflicts and contributes to violence against our communities. And I think that that has gotten a little bit lost sometimes in these conversations.
Thank you, Fee, for reminding us of that. Seung-Yun, there's so much heart and pain here, but and so much need for thoughtful push forward. And a lot of that is also based in data. The organization that you run, the National Pacific American Women's Forum, recently released the report, The State of Safety for Asian American and Pacific Islander Women in the U.S. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that to sharpen our thinking about everything that we experience and intuit, but now we can show in a way that hasn't been seen.
Yes, thank you for bringing attention to that. We did a national polling of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander women across the country to really understand where folks are at in terms of safety, right? I mean, I agree with Fee that, not safety, violence and lack of safety is not just interpersonal, but we also wanted to understand how deeply felt this was across the board. And one of the most shocking statistics that we found is that we were able to collect enough data to disaggregate by subgroups. So Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, Southeast Asians, South Asians, and East Asians. And there was no statistical difference between any of the subgroups around the question of have you experienced discrimination or harassment in the last 12 months? 74% of our respondents said that they have, right? When we watch the news, we hear these really extreme cases, which usually ends in murder or really severe physical violence. But what this tells me is that there's so much happening in our communities that never rise to the surface or people hear about, but it is really widely shared, right? And our respondents, 71% of the respondents said that they have more fear and anxiety because of the violence that's happening. So it's also impacting people's mental health. And so you can see that there's so many things that are related, and it's not just one thing or another. It's not just a COVID related, or, if you live in some of these bigger cities where you're hearing the statistics, that it is widely felt by a lot of people. And so I think it's really important to highlight that this isn't something that's happening to specific groups of us, but that it is across the board. And I think that was, to me, the most significant, that, it is not just issue that we're dealing with in New York City or San Francisco, or just with these Asian Americans, but that it is being felt very widely.
Thank you. Again, now that we can show it, we can talk about it in a way that isn't just letting folks brush it aside as like invisible or normalized, or I hate to say it this way, but like as if we were expendable when it comes to crises and traumas and that this kind of violence. You've proven the point, and I hope everybody takes notice. Amanda, my friend, you're a longtime champion for both the Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community and survivors of sexual assault. I was wondering if you could share with us some of your insights on the relationship between gender-based violence and anti-Asian racism.
Yeah, absolutely. Our liberation is bound together, and the intersection of race and gender cannot be ignored when it comes to the violence that we're seeing against the Asian American community, especially AAPI women. Now, I speak from experience. I am a rape survivor, and I want to put this into context. 60% of AAPI women are survivors of sexual or domestic assault. That's according to AAPI Women Lead, 60%. There is a direct causation between the hypersexualization of our bodies and the violence we see, whether that's through the media, through plays like Miss Saigon, reinforced. And our bodies have been fetishized for centuries, right? It's clear that, let's take the Atlanta Small Massacre as an example, that both racism and misogyny provoked this massacre. You know, when the murderer said that it was a sex addiction, but didn't say it was racism, we still knew. And I am calling on, of course, other allies outside our community, but I'm also calling on our brothers in the Asian community to see this and to acknowledge that there is an intersection of race and gender when it comes to the violence we're seeing against our community.
Thank you, Amanda. That's a powerful message, a call to action that I hope everybody hears and will continue to pass along and I don't know, hold people accountable and have higher expectations. Yeah. This is the last question for the panel before we have to unfortunately end this, but I kind of feel like I don't ever spend enough time with any of the three of you. And so I'll be trying to do that more. But and here I want to kind of pivot a little bit from like these dark realities, these stark facts, the horrors and the traumas that we hold and carry to translate into something brighter and lighter. And that's hope, right? So Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander women are often portrayed as submissive and docile. And we know that this is harmful and inaccurate as a stereotype, but recent media coverage has contributed to the narrative of AA and NHPI women as perpetual victims. How do we change this narrative so that we can talk about it in a way that's empowering and that pays due deference to the extraordinary strength and resilience of our community instead? I'm wondering, panelists, what your message is to the Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander women right now looking to fight back, or to, Amanda, if you don't mind borrowing Rise's phrase, pen their civil rights into existence. What steps can they take to regain a sense of autonomy and empowerment during this kind of time of reckoning, but also, kind of narrative change and moment to pivot? I'll open it up to anybody who wants to volunteer to go first, unless that's unfair. Amanda, can I call on you if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I want to tell folks that your joy is the most radical form of rebellion. I know that a lot of people, especially API women, I've heard, are having an internal struggle. Do I speak up when I still feel vulnerable? Am I okay? And first of all, I want to say that you are not alone. And yourself as you are is enough. You are more than enough. we exist in a world with institutions and systems that aren't meant for us. And the fact that you are living and breathing and being who you are is radical, transformational, and amazing. So I want to recognize that. But also I want to say to everybody else that we're not your model minority. We are not silent. We have never been silent. There have been amazing AAPI women leaders that have been doing this work for a long, long time. And just know that no one is powerless when we come together, and no one is invisible when we demand to be seen. So demand to be seen.
It's demand to be seen. Thank you, Amanda. Sungyeon, can I turn to you? You're next on my screen.
Of course. Thanks for that, Amanda. I was inspired. You're absolutely right about radical joy. I think that joy is an act of, radical living. I agree with that. And, I also want to say that, in the arc of our history, in the grand scheme of things, we're not the first ones here, and we will not be the last ones here. And I think where I draw strength from and perspective is that we are, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander women haven't only survived, but thrived. And that's why we're here, right? And so regardless of how other people want to see us, this is about us continuing the fight that our, ancestors have started, right? This isn't something we all of a sudden feel like we're cornered into doing because we have no choice. And so I draw a lot of strength from thinking about my own, great grandmothers and grandmothers who lived through the Japanese occupation and the Korean War and US militarism and all of that, and draw strength from that. And just because now other people are noticing and hearing our stories for the first time and have these like horrific reactions, it doesn't mean that we haven't been fighting, that we haven't been warriors. And so to me, that's where I go to. It's not about the external. It's not about what all of a sudden mainstream America is feeling and thinking about. It's really about where our drive and our resolve is coming from. And I hope that, wherever you are today, that your focus is really about honoring your ancestors and building a better world for those who are to come after us.
Thank you. Our ancestors were warriors under their circumstances, and look at what we can do with ours, right? Fee, can I ask you to close for us? Thank you.
Sure. And I think both Amanda and Sungyeon already sort of touched on this in their responses too, but I would, start by pushing back or challenging the notion that we have to regain autonomy and empowerment, because I think we inadvertently feed the model minority myth when we concede a false or warped sense of silence from our communities. I've heard people make the call to break the silence, but when I think about my community of Asian American and NHPI mothers and aunties and peers, I think about how loud and demanding and bossy they are. I think about how we have a rich and raucous and strong legacy of AA and NHPI women in activism. That's our history, that's our legacy, and our work now should be connecting our newer American community members to that long and collective AA and NHPI history. We have Mabel Lee, who was a suffragist who mobilized the Chinese community in America to support women's rights to vote back in the early 1900s, even though she herself did not gain the right to vote with the 19th Amendment because of racist laws that prohibited Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens. We have Yuri Kochiyama, who after being incarcerated at a Japanese American incarceration camp during World War II, dedicated her whole long life to social justice and liberation movements, and did all of that work in an intersectional and cross-racial way. And then we also have countless AA and NHPI women who we won't read about in history books, women like our moms, and like my mom specifically, who fled the US as a Vietnamese refugee in 1979, and who, despite everything that she lacked here in America, was able to build a safe and loving home for her 5 daughters, who are all now grown, and honoring that legacy, her legacy, in our own ways.
Thank you, Fee. I knew you would wrap us beautifully here. And it's honoring the fierce sisters who preceded us, and our obligation, I think, to continue that work and not to dismiss or diminish that, but to really hold that power as kind of one of the propellants of strength for us too, for those who are coming behind us as well, above and beyond this moment. With that, I just thank you so much for the honor of leading this conversation and for joining us in this space. I can't express my gratitude enough. So I'll just stop the awkwardness and turn it back over to Rebecca. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you to our wonderful panelists for that very important and insightful conversation. Next up, we have a fireside chat moderated by Crystal Kai with Grace Wong, the Policy Director at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and Victoria Nguyen, a Senior Vice President of the Center for Pan-Asian Community Services. Both Grace and Victoria serve on President Biden's Advisory Commission on AA and NHPIs. Crystal, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Erica. And so we're so honored to be joined today by 2 of our esteemed commissioners who were appointed by the president last year to serve on the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, which is charged with providing recommendations to the president on ways to advance equity, justice, and opportunity for our communities. I know both Grace and Victoria have very deep roots in our communities, and we're so honored to have them here with us today. So I'll just open it up with having a question for both of you. I know that both of you represent nonprofit organizations who work closely with the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities to address challenges that they are facing. So can you speak a little bit more to what you've witnessed and heard from Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders, and particularly women over the past 2 years of the pandemic? Grace, we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. So as you can see, I'm with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and we support a network of local, community-based, culturally specific domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy programs all across the country who are working directly with AAPI survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And what we've been hearing from the advocates and survivors directly has been, the pandemic has contributed to an increase in escalation of domestic violence against women in their homes. In particular, at the beginning, when there were lockdowns, we were seeing reports of much more severe violence, higher levels of injury. People were reporting how their abusers weren't letting them go out. They were using the COVID itself as kind of a tool of coercion or threatening, just really isolating people because of it. And then for the programs themselves, because of all the changes in information we were getting about the disease and all the changes about rules and new programs to support our communities in dealing with COVID, we were really hearing from the advocates the challenges they faced as multilingual advocates, that they were serving as interpreters, having to serve as interpreters for survivors in every single forum, because the information was changing rapidly, and the incredible burden that placed on them, and helping survivors navigate the courts and unemployment and the food bank and all the different systems that had different rules. And finally, the challenges that the advocates and survivors themselves had been articulating about the increase in violence and against AAPI, communities, against women in particular. Survivors were saying they did not want to go out and get help because they were afraid to just go out into public. And, the advocates in programs themselves were saying the same thing, that they had concerns going into community because of fear of the violence that we've been talking about today. So I mean, it's been quite a challenge, and we can talk about it more, but how folks are dealing with it. But yeah, the last few years have been, in addition to just the disease itself and the burden that all of us have been facing, the victims of domestic and sexual violence have really seen a lot more harm. So
thank you for sharing that, Grace, and uplifting really just how just the compounded challenges that we've seen impacting Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander women throughout the pandemic, including those who are the victims of domestic and gender-based violence. Victoria, your organization, and you were based directly in Atlanta, where these horrific murders happened last year. And so what are you hearing from the communities that you work with through CPACs?
Yes, thank you, Crystal. And it's just an honor to be on this panel with Grace. So I'm calling, with the Center for Pain and Community Services. And, over the past 42 years, we've been working with the communities and kind of the boots on the ground, right? Listening to our communities. And right before March 16th shooting, we actually launched listening sessions and listening tours with our community-based organizations. And then we've already heard, the fear and the concern from, our API community, AA and NHPI communities in Atlanta of, what would happen, right? When there is a crisis in our communities, where will our communities go? There was already fears and concerns with our grandmothers going out grocery shopping by themselves, right? And having to take alternative routes and, having to go out in certain times of the day to ensure that, they would be safe. Even transportation, we even, saw a decline in our communities accessing our transit systems. And CPACs has a shuttle bus. And we saw a decline in grandmas, coming to our senior wellness programs because of concerns, right, of being out and about. Even with our domestic violence shelter, right, there was also a concern with, women seeking support, right, and going out. And with, isolating in place, we heard, there was, a rise in, cases of abuse because, with the isolation, a lot of our community members just, had more the proximity, right, with our abusers. And it was just retriggering of trauma, right, of all these stories and, hosting 25 listening sessions with over 250 of our community members and hearing from the women leaders and community-based organizers and activists, how difficult it was for them, especially for, communities who fled, their countries from war, from violence, witnessing rape and murders and coming to America, a safe haven, a place that they feel that they could raise their families and be safe, right? And seeing this attack on their communities. So it's definitely been a challenge and still very much emotional.
Thank you for sharing that, Victoria. Grace, you kind of alluded to this earlier, but really core component of the work that you do through your nonprofit organization is to provide culturally and linguistically specific resources to the community. And just wondering if you could provide a little bit more information about that work and why it is so critical to so many within the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community that we have that sort of assistance provided directly to our communities as well.
Sure. So we support a network of culturally specific organizations that are rooted in Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. And they are programs that really are, like Victoria's program, led by and are specifically for our communities and sub-communities where there are advocates or, providers who are understand where people have come from and their backgrounds, as well as, can speak the languages that they do. And it's so important at this time because we know that, for our community constituents, that survivors of domestic and sexual violence, may not be aware of what some of the mainstream resources might be, and are going to go to people that look like them, that's speak the same language, that they trust, that are often the information about them is shared through friends and family, as opposed through other mechanisms. And we know that survivors really want to go to a place where they know that many of them are immigrants and may fear reaching out for some other services that they fear might interfere with their immigration status, or they might risk being deported, or they may fear calling police because of their backgrounds and their experiences in working, or how police respond in other places. And so we are especially appreciative of the resources that have been invested, especially for domestic and sexual violence, that you mentioned at the beginning of this call, and in terms of investing in culturally specific services for domestic and sexual violence. And we are working with our partners in trying to make sure that money is out and available for victim services in culturally specific communities. So with that, I'm sure that I'll pass it on here.
Thank you for sharing that, Grace. And yeah, absolutely, it's so important that for a community as diverse as ours, that we can really ensure that there is culturally and linguistically appropriate services to our diverse communities. Victoria, we've talked a little bit about this intersectionality of identities, not just being Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, but also women. And Grace mentioned also the diverse immigration or immigrant status of individuals in our community. And so I know that part of for your organization, CPACS, part of your mission is to promote self-sufficiency for immigrants, refugees, and traditionally overlooked communities. So can you speak a little bit more to what that looks like, especially in a state like Georgia, where the community is still very much growing, and we don't necessarily have the same infrastructure that we see in other states where we have larger Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities? And just speak a little bit more to the work that you are doing through CPACS to really ensure that this community, this really rapidly growing community in Georgia, has the resources it needs.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. The AA NHPI community is fairly, it's not new, but fairly new compared to areas of the coast, right? Like New York and California. We still have a large limited English proficient community, large foreign-born population, and very much first generation community. And a lot of our work has been capacity building and building on the strengths and the incredible community that we have here in Georgia. And I know a lot of the resources that have been coming out on Stop API Hate or Stop Asian Hate has been typically coming from other areas, but in Georgia there has just been incredible coalitions being built in different spaces, community-based organizations and faith-based leaders coming together, and also sourcing funding and support to build the train tracks, the capacity, right, for our communities to address in moments of crisis, and also to build resources and hosting a lot of listening sessions, right, because our communities are so diverse. We have a large immigrant population from the Burmese and Bhutanese community here in Atlanta, and making sure that we have those conversations together and learn from each other, and having monthly meetings where we can discuss, healing circles, rallies, vigils, and even, work with our allies from other racial groups and sharing our experiences to build the infrastructure and the network for our AA and NHPI communities in Atlanta. And our conversations has always been centering our communities, making sure that we listen to our communities, again, through listening sessions and having a very open door policy where our communities can reach out to us and let us know that we're not doing a good job or we're not addressing these issues that the community really needs for us to address. And our support is long-term. We want to make sure that the funding and support is ongoing, and making sure that the funders are connected to our communities, and making sure that our funders are also getting the training to provide the direct support instead of going through umbrella organizations here in Atlanta.
Thank you for that, Victoria. And we are so from hearing you both, we're just so grateful to have your expertise on our commission. You really do bring community-centered solutions, to the work that you are doing. And so we're really, again, so honored to have you both. I know we're we've gone over time, unfortunately, but I just kind of want to wrap up really quickly. Having you folks, we learned a lot about some of the challenges that Asian American, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders are facing, but also want this event to be an opportunity to provide a healing and empowering space for our community. So what advice and words of encouragement do you want our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander women who are listening in today to take away from today's event? Start with you, Grace.
Oh, I think that, as tragic as the events of the last year and the last few years have been, it's really, the events have really brought us, a lot of awareness about, the experiences we've all experienced. And I think in doing that, there have been opportunities for people to heal and to come together to talk about, the experiences we all face together as Asian American women and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander. And so I guess, my inspiration is that the hurt has brought us together, and I hope that we have opportunities, more of them like this, to come together and lift each other up, to celebrate our strength, as Erica had talked about earlier. And I'm really looking forward to more opportunities to get some of the resources that are out, that are coming down, to work harder for more and to get more of them out to our communities, to strengthen our relationships together. So thank you.
Thank you, Grace. And Victoria, why don't you close us out? What words of encouragement do you want everyone to leave with today?
Yeah, I'm just so proud to be part of this network of really incredible, resilient AA and NHPI women who've, always taught me to, one, uplift women at the table, and also support women who are, by inviting them to the table, and also to support women on the way to the table. And that has always kind of stuck with me, and just really grateful for all of the incredible AA and NHPI women who've just kind of paved the way, and will continue to support us in our journey of seeking equity for our communities.
Well, thank you both again for your tremendous work within our communities, as well as for those words of inspiration. I know that we are now over time, but really quickly, I wanted to close with saying that after this event, we are actually going to be hosting, through the White House Initiative on AA and NHPI's, a series of regional virtual roundtables. Beginning at 2:30 today, actually, our first two will be occurring, one for the New England region, and then the other in the Southeast region, which includes Georgia. And I know, Victoria, you'll be a part of that too. So we're going to be hopping off shortly, but we do encourage those of you who are interested to engage more in some of our regional roundtables, where we will be sharing region-specific and state-specific resources from the federal government, and also providing more room for dialogue and opportunities to reflect on today's session. If you have not already, you should have received a lot of the Zoom links for those in the initial invitation for this national stakeholder briefing. But if you need to get a hold of that information, if you don't have it, you can email Howard O, or you can reach out to WHIAANHPI at WHIAANHPI@hhs.gov for more information. So with that, I just want to thank again our panelists for joining us today, and I will turn it back over to Morgan Mills to close us out.
Thank you so much, Crystal, and thank you, Grace and Victoria, for that wonderful conversation. So thank you to everyone who joined us today and participated. We are honored that you decided to Zoom in with us today, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your Women's History Month. So with that, I will turn it over to our closing performance. Erica Shimizu-Banks will be performing. She will be accompanied by Mark Scamenti, and they will be performing her song, Oaxaca Mairi. The floor is yours, Erica.
Thank you so much, Morgan, and thank you so much for having us to perform this song. I wrote this song when I accompanied my mother in Japan to visit the graves of our ancestors. And in that visit, I learned so much more, not just about my family, but about my mother. And even though on the gravestone, as is in many cultures, only the names of the men were written on the stone, what I learned from that visit was the stories of strength and resilience and hope from the women in my family. And so with that, I think as we reflect and commemorate on the massacre that occurred in Atlanta last year and the violence that continues to occur to racialized people in this country and in the AA NHPI community, we must look to the past and the history of both violence and oppression that we have yet to be held accountable for and to rectify in order to make a better future, and also look to the examples of strength and resilience and hope from the past to make a better future. So with that, this is Ohaka Mairi, which means grave visiting.
We took the train the long way. I think we missed a transfer. I didn't want to ask you. You wouldn't have an answer. As you looked out the window, the decades, years they passed by. I saw your heart, you're still the little girl your mother raised alone. All alone, all alone, all alone. Oh, how come I long for our history. Oh, how come could they have imagined me? We wiped away the cobwebs, the dust it settled in, the characters carved into the stone that carries our family name. Oh, the pain, it still remains. What would he claim if he were here? Oh, how come I carry our legacy? Oh, how come I will remember you as you wish to be, how you were free, buried with me. Now we are free.
Thank you.